It started with a whisper that echoed louder than a scream. Julia West, a journalist known for her hard-hitting op-eds and razor-sharp critiques, thrived on controversy. Her work wasn't just polarizing, it was incendiary. To some, she was a fearless truth-teller exposing uncomfortable realities. To others, she was a megaphone for division, her words laced with undertones that seemed to favor her biases. But to Julia, she was simply doing her job, reporting what she believed to be the truth. And yet, deep down, Julia wasn't entirely at peace with herself. That unease, though buried, would soon rise to the surface in ways she never could have predicted. Julia's career had been built on what she called fearless journalism, but her critics often labeled it something far less noble. Her editorials, especially those addressing race and culture, sparked outrage. She claimed she was holding people accountable. Others argued she was fueling hate. But Julia didn't care what they thought. She thrived on the attention, the clicks, the debates. She told herself it was her job to speak hard truths, even if others didn't like it. The turning point came on a cold November morning, when Julia received an assignment she initially thought was beneath her. The editor of her publication, an aging idealist named Ben Carter, believed in sending his writers out into the world, especially when their views were, as he put it, narrowed by the walls of their own perspective. He handed Julia a file with a smirk that irritated her. "You want me to spend a week with them?" she asked, her voice sharp with disdain. "Yes," Ben replied calmly, leaning back in his creaky chair. "There's a story here, Julia, a real story. Not just the kind you write from a distance. They hate people like me," Julia said, crossing her arms defensively. "Maybe," Ben replied, his eyes steady on hers. "Or maybe you've got it backward. Either way, you're going." The them Ben referred to as a tight-knit community of immigrants and refugees who had settled in the heart of the city, creating a vibrant neighborhood rich in culture, but often misunderstood or ignored by the media. Julia had written about them before, though she had never set foot there. Her pieces were scathing, painting the residents as burdens to the system and threats to the real fabric of society. Now, Ben wanted her to live among them, to see their world up close. The very thought made her uneasy. When she arrived at the community center, the hub of the neighborhood, Julia immediately felt out of place. The air was thick with unfamiliar spices and languages she didn't recognize. Children ran barefoot, their laughter echoing off the graffiti-covered walls. Women in vibrant scarves haggled over produce at a small outdoor market. Men gathered on the corner, deep in animated conversation. It was a scene that should have felt ordinary, but to Julia it was foreign, almost threatening. Her first interaction was with Layla, a middle-aged woman with a warm smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Layla was a volunteer at the center, tasked with showing Julia around. "Welcome," she said, her accent thick but her tone kind. "I hear you're here to write about us." Julia nodded, her professional mask firmly in place. "That's right. I'm hoping to understand your community better." Layla's smile faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered. "Then you've come to the right place." The week that followed was nothing like Julia expected. She met Ahmed, a widowed father of 3 who worked 3 jobs to keep his children in school. There was Fatima, a teenager who dreamed of becoming a doctor, but faced barriers Julia had never imagined. And then there was Rashid, an elderly man who had fled war only to build a thriving business selling handcrafted goods. Each story was a thread, weaving a tapestry of resilience and hope. But Julia couldn't ignore the unease bubbling inside her. These weren't the people she had written about. They weren't the caricatures she had built in her mind. One night, Julia found herself sitting in the center's small library, flipping through books on the history of migration. Layla entered quietly, carrying 2 cups of tea. She placed one in front of Julia and sat down across from her. "You look tired," she said softly. Julia hesitated, then nodded. "This isn't what I expected," she admitted. "What did you expect?" Layla asked, her tone gentle but probing. I don't know, Julia said, though she did. She had expected to find confirmation of her beliefs, to see the flaws she had written about so many times. Instead, she found people, complex, flawed, and deeply human. Layla studied her for a moment. You can't write the truth until you see it, she said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had lived through things Julia couldn't begin to imagine. The week ended with a community dinner, a lively event filled with music, dancing, and laughter. Julia sat at a long table surrounded by people who, just days earlier, she had feared. As she listened to their stories, she felt something shift inside her. It wasn't dramatic or sudden, but it was there, a seed of doubt about the narratives she had clung to for so long. On her last night, as Julia prepared to leave, Armand approached her. "You came here to write about us," he said, "but I hope you also learned something for yourself." Julia didn't respond right away. She couldn't. Her mind was racing with questions she didn't yet have answers to. As she walked out into the crisp night air, she realized she had a choice to make. She could return to her old ways, writing from a place of fear and ignorance, or she could let this experience transform her. The story was far from over, but for Julia, one thing was clear. She could no longer see the world as she once had. The walk back to her car was unusually quiet. The sounds of the lively dinner behind her faded with every step, replaced by the low hum of streetlights and the occasional distant bark of a dog. Julia paused at the edge of the parking lot, her breath visible in the cold night air. She felt the weight of something unspoken pressing down on her chest, a strange mix of guilt and curiosity. She unlocked her car but didn't get in right away. Instead, she leaned against the driver's door, staring up at the scattered stars above. Her mind replayed Ahmed's words. Asterisk, "You came here to write about us, but I hope you also learned something for yourself." Asterisk, she didn't know what to make of it. She wasn't sure she wanted to know. The next morning, Julia sat at her desk, staring at a blank Word document. Her editor, Ben, had told her to take her time, but Julia knew the story was due soon. Usually, she thrived under pressure. Words came easily, ideas flowed naturally. This time, though, she felt paralyzed. Every sentence she started felt wrong, hollow, or incomplete. She glanced at the folder of notes she'd scribbled throughout the week. Normally, her notes were filled with sharp observations and bold opinions, but this time they read more like scattered thoughts. She had quotes from Ahmed about his children's dreams. She had snippets of Fatima's laughter as she described her favorite books. There were even moments when she'd written about Layla's calm presence, the way she always seemed to know the right thing to say. But none of it added up to a story Julia knew how to tell. Julia sighed and pushed her chair back, pacing the small apartment. Her eyes landed on her bookshelf, cluttered with awards and framed magazine covers featuring her name in bold letters. She had built a career on fearlessness, on speaking truths others were too afraid to confront. But now she wasn't so sure she had ever truly understood what she was writing about. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Julia couldn't focus. She kept checking her phone, scrolling aimlessly through social media, hoping for inspiration or maybe just a distraction. That's when she saw it, an article shared by a former colleague, its headline unmistakably targeting her. Asterisk, when journalism becomes a tool for division. A closer look at Julia West's controversial career. Asterisk. Her stomach dropped. Clicking on the link felt like touching a flame, but she did it anyway. The article was brutal, dissecting her past work and accusing her of perpetuating harmful stereotypes. It cited specific examples, like her infamous piece about crime rates among immigrants, a piece Julia had once been proud of but now felt uneasy thinking about. The writer didn't hold back, calling her dangerously out of touch and accusing her of using fear as a weapon. But what stung the most wasn't the criticism, it was the timing. The article had been published just hours ago, while Julia was still grappling with the experience at the community center. It felt like the universe was closing in on her. Julia spent the next hour reading through the comments section. Some were supportive, defending her right to free speech. Others were far less kind, calling for boycotts of her work and questioning her integrity. A few comments stood out though, quiet, thoughtful responses from people who simply asked, Asterisk, have you ever actually met the people you write about? Asterisk. That question lingered in her mind long after she closed her laptop. By the time the sun set, Julia found herself back in her car, driving aimlessly through the city. She didn't know where she was going until she got there, the community center. The building was dark, its doors locked for the night. But even sitting outside, Julia felt a strange sense of comfort. This place, once so unfamiliar and intimidating, now felt like the only part of her world that made sense. Her phone buzzed, breaking her train of thought. It was a text from Layla. Just asked about you. He says the kids are asking when you'll visit again. Julia stared at the message for a long time, her fingers hovering over the screen. Finally, she typed back a simple response. Tell him I'll be back tomorrow. The next day, Julia returned to the community center with a notebook and a plan. She told herself she was there to gather more material for her article. But deep down, she knew that wasn't the whole truth. She wanted answers, not just for her readers, but for herself. Ahmed greeted her with a smile, his youngest daughter clinging shyly to his leg. You came back, he said, sounding genuinely surprised. I promised I would, Julia replied, forcing a small smile. Ahmed led her into the center's library, where the children were gathered for a storytelling session. Fatima was there, reading aloud to a group of younger kids. Her voice was steady and full of emotion, bringing the story to life in a way that held everyone's attention. Julia couldn't help but admire her. Later, Julia sat down with Ahmed over tea, her notebook open on the table between them. She asked him questions about his life, questions she should have asked long before she ever wrote a word about people like him. He told her about the war that had forced him to leave his home, the harrowing journey that brought him to this country, and the struggles he faced building a new life. But I don't want to talk about that too much, said, waving his hand dismissively. We've all been through hard times. What matters is what we do now, how we move forward. Julia nodded, scribbling in her notebook, though her mind was spinning. Ahmed's story was powerful, but it wasn't the only one. Everyone in this community had a story like his, stories of loss, resilience, and hope. Julia realized she had spent years writing about these people as though they were statistics or abstract ideas. She had never seen them as individuals until now. By the end of the day, Julia felt more conflicted than ever. She drove home in silence, her mind racing with questions she didn't know how to answer. How could she write this story in a way that felt true, not just to the people she had met, but to herself? And what would it mean for her career if she admitted, even subtly, that she had been wrong before? Julia didn't have those answers yet, but as she lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, she felt something shift inside her. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't thinking about headlines or clicks. She was thinking about the people she had met, the lives she had glimpsed, and the responsibility she carried as a journalist to tell their stories with honesty and care. The tension in her chest hadn't disappeared. If anything, it had grown stronger. But for the first time, Julia didn't see it as a burden. She saw it as a challenge, a chance to do better, and she wasn't going to back down. The next few days unfolded like a series of quiet revelations. Julia kept returning to the community center, sometimes unannounced, sometimes after a quick text exchange with Layla or Ahmed. What began as an assignment she had begrudgingly accepted now felt like something else entirely, something she couldn't yet name. Every time she stepped through those doors, she felt a little closer to understanding, though she still couldn't shake the tension sitting heavily in her chest. Her conversations with Ahmed became a regular part of her visits. Sometimes they talked about his children, about how his oldest son wanted to study engineering, and how he'd been saving every spare dollar to help make it happen. Other times they sat in comfortable silence, sipping tea while children played noisily in the background. Julia found herself drawn to Ahmed's calmness, the way he seemed to carry hope in the face of challenges she could barely imagine. But not everything she encountered at the community center was comforting. There was an undercurrent of fear in nearly every story she heard. Fear of deportation, fear of discrimination, fear of being misunderstood or unseen. Rashid, the elderly artisan who made intricate wood carvings, spoke of customers who refused to buy from him once they learned his origins. Fatima shared how, despite excelling in school, she sometimes overheard teachers doubting her abilities because of her accent. Even Layla, who seemed unshakable, admitted late one evening that she often worried about her teenage son being stopped by the police for no reason other than how he looked. Julia tried to absorb it all, but with every new story, the weight on her shoulders grew heavier. She had written articles about these fears before, but they had always felt abstract, theoretical. Now they had faces and names, and the deeper she dug, the more she realized how much she had missed. One afternoon, Julia was sitting with Layla in the community garden, jotting down notes as they talked. The air was crisp, the sky a bright blue, but the conversation took a somber turn when Layla asked her a question Julia hadn't been prepared for. "Why do you think people like us scare people like you?" Layla asked, her voice quiet but steady. Julia froze, her pen hovering above the page. The question was blunt, and she felt the sting of it even though Layla's tone wasn't accusatory. "I don't know," Julia admitted after a long pause. "Maybe it's because people fear what they don't understand." Layla nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on the rows of vegetables in front of them. "Fear can be dangerous," she said, "but it can also be a chance to learn, if you let it." Julia thought about that for the rest of the day, replaying the conversation over and over in her mind. Layla's words felt like a mirror, reflecting Julia's own biases back at her in ways she couldn't ignore. She wondered how much of her own fear, her own ignorance, had shaped the stories she had written in the past. As the week went on, Julia began noticing things she hadn't paid attention to before, like the way Ahmed always kept his tone polite but firm when speaking to people outside the community, as if he were constantly trying to prove something. Or the way Fatima's younger brother clung tightly to his backpack when they walked to school, as if it contained his entire sense of security. One evening, as she was packing up to leave the center, Julia overheard a tense conversation between Ahmed and another man. They were speaking in hushed voices near the doorway, but Julia could catch enough of the conversation to piece together what was happening. A local landlord had raised the rent on several apartments in the neighborhood, including Ahmed's. The increase was steep, too steep for most families to afford. Ahmed was trying to organize a meeting with the landlord to negotiate, but the man seemed uninterested in hearing them out. "Maybe we should go to the press," the other man suggested. Ahmed shook his head. "And let them twist our words." "No, we'll figure this out ourselves." Julia felt a pang of guilt as she stepped outside. She had been one of those reporters who twisted words, who painted stories in broad, unkind strokes. And now, even when her intentions were different, people like Ahmed didn't trust her profession. That night, Julia stayed up late, poring over her old articles. She read them with new eyes, cringing at the way she had framed certain issues, at the assumptions she had made without ever speaking to the people affected. She thought about the landlord raising rents, about the systemic challenges that kept people like Ahmed struggling no matter how hard they worked. And she thought about the role she had played, intentionally or not, in perpetuating those challenges. The next day, Julia returned to the community center with a different purpose. She wanted to talk to Ahmed about the rent issue, to understand how it was affecting the families in the neighborhood. But when she arrived, Ahmed wasn't there. Layla told her he was meeting with some of the other tenants, trying to come up with a plan. Instead, Julia spent the afternoon talking to Rashid, the elderly artisan. He was working on a new carving, a scene of a crowded marketplace filled with tiny, intricate details. Julia watched as his hands moved deftly over the wood, shaping it with practiced precision. "This reminds me of home," Rashid said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "Back there, we had nothing, but we had each other." Here, it's harder. Everyone is too busy trying to survive. Julia asked him if he ever thought about going back. Every day, Rashid said with a sad smile, but there's nothing to go back to. His words stayed with her long after she left. They reminded her of something Ahmed had said earlier in the week, that people like him weren't here because they wanted to be, but because they had no other choice. Julia began to see the conflict more clearly now. It wasn't just about individual stories or struggles. It was about systems that made it so hard for people like Ahmed, Rashid, and Fatima to succeed. It was about fear, both from the people in the community and the people outside of it, who saw them as threats rather than neighbors. And then there was Julia's own conflict, the growing realization that she had been complicit in perpetuating those systems, in stoking those fears. She didn't know how to reconcile that with the person she wanted to be. As she sat in her apartment that night, staring once again at her blank Word document, Julia felt the weight of it all pressing down on her. She couldn't go back to the way things were before, but she wasn't sure how to move forward either. The tension was building, and Julia could feel it in every corner of her life. She knew she was on the edge of something big, something that could change everything. But she didn't know what it was yet, or how to face it. And the closer she got to the truth, the more she realized just how much was at stake. Julia's mind was restless as the days blurred into one another, each visit to the community center drawing her deeper into the lives of the people she had once written about with cold detachment. The tension she felt wasn't just internal anymore, it was tangible, looming over the entire neighborhood like a storm ready to break. The issue with the landlord had become the spark for something larger. Families were organizing, speaking out, but there was a growing fear that their efforts wouldn't be enough. Ahmed seemed more burdened every time Julia saw him, though he still tried to maintain his calm demeanor. She caught him rubbing his temples after a long meeting one evening, his shoulders hunched with exhaustion. Julia wanted to offer help, to do something tangible, but she wasn't sure what. Writing another article felt too simple, too detached. She didn't just want to tell her story this time, she wanted to get it right. One evening, as Julia was leaving the center, Aunt caught up to her in the parking lot. The air was thick with the smell of rain, and the sky was a dull gray. Ahmed's expression was unreadable, but his tone was urgent. "There's something I need to show you," he said. He led her to his car, where he handed her a worn folder filled with documents, leases, rent increase notices, and letters from the landlord. Julia thumbed through them, her heart sinking as she realized just how dire the situation was. The rent hikes weren't just steep, they were designed to force these families out. The landlord had already begun serving eviction notices to a few tenants who couldn't pay the new rates. "This isn't just about the rent," Aunt said. "They want us gone. They think if they raise the price high enough, we'll just disappear." Julia clenched the folder tightly, anger bubbling beneath the surface. "Why haven't you gone to the media about this? This is illegal. It has to be." Aunt gave her a weary look. "Do you really think anyone would care? They'll just see it as another story about immigrants not paying their bills. People don't want to hear about the truth. They want a story that makes them feel justified in their fear." His words hit Julia harder than she expected. She had spent years writing exactly those kinds of stories, feeding into the same narrative Ahmed was describing. But this time she couldn't walk away. She wouldn't. That night, Julia stayed up late researching housing laws and tenant rights, trying to arm herself with knowledge. She called Layla the next morning and asked if she could attend one of the tenant meetings. Layla sounded surprised but agreed, her voice tinged with cautious hope. The meeting was held in the small basement of the community center. It was crowded and chaotic, with voices overlapping as tenants shared their concerns. Some were angry, their frustration boiling over as they talked about the impossible choices they were facing: pay the rent or feed their families. Others were quieter, their fear evident in the way they kept glancing at the door, as if expecting someone to burst in and shut them down. Julia sat in the corner, taking notes but mostly listening. She was struck by the resilience in the room, the way these families were coming together despite the odds stacked against them. but she also felt the weight of their desperation. They needed help, more than she could offer with just words. After the meeting, Ahmed pulled her aside. "You don't have to do this," he said. "This isn't your fight." Julia shook her head. "It is now." She spent the next few days immersing herself in the tenants' struggle, learning their stories in detail. She spoke to Rashid, who had been served an eviction notice, even though he had never missed a rent payment in over 5 years. She talked to a single mother who worked 2 jobs and still couldn't afford the new rates. And she listened to Ahmed, who explained how this kind of displacement wasn't just happening here. It was part of a larger trend pushing marginalized communities out of the city entirely. But not everyone was on board with Julia's involvement. Some tenants were wary of her, questioning her motives. One man confronted her during a meeting, his voice sharp with distrust. "Why are you really here?" he demanded. "You think you can just swoop in, write your little story, and fix everything? People like you only show up when there's something to gain." Julia didn't have an answer. She couldn't blame him for doubting her. She had spent her career proving people like him right, but she stayed anyway, determined to show that this time was different. The turning point came when Julia attended a rally the tenants had organized. It was a chilly evening, and a small crowd had gathered outside the landlord's office, holding signs and chanting slogans. Julia stood on the edges at first, observing, but as the crowd grew louder, she felt herself drawn in. The energy was electric, a mix of hope and defiance. For the first time, Julia wasn't just an outsider looking in, she was part of something bigger. But the rally didn't go as planned. A few men in suits came out of the office, their expressions cold and dismissive. One of them waved a piece of paper in the air, a cease and desist letter, threatening legal action if the protests continued. The crowd fell silent, the weight of the threat sinking in. Julia felt her heart race as she watched Ahmed step forward to confront the men. His voice was steady, but she could see the tension in his posture. "We're not going anywhere," he said firmly. "You can't silence us." The men exchanged a look, then turned and walked back into the building. The rally ended shortly after, the crowd dispersing in uneasy silence. Back at the community center, the mood was somber. Ahmed sat at a table, his head in his hands, while the other tenants murmured quietly among themselves. Julia sat down across from him, unsure of what to say. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," said, his voice heavy with frustration. "They'll keep pushing until we break." Julia looked around the room, at the faces of the people who had trusted her to tell their story. She thought about the power of words, about how they could be used to harm or heal. And for the first time, she felt the full weight of that responsibility. "We won't let them win," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "Not this time." Ahmed looked up, his eyes searching hers for a moment before he nodded. "Then we fight." Julia didn't know what would come next, but she knew they were on the brink of something that could either shatter everything or bring them closer to justice. The stakes had never been higher, and the tension had never been more palpable. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, Julia felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. The tension in the room at the community center hung thick in the air. People milled around quietly, some strategizing, others comforting one another, but the energy felt subdued after the landlord's legal threat. Julia sat at a table, her notebook untouched for once. She couldn't stop replaying the rally in her mind. Ahmed's brave stand, the cold indifference of the men in suits, and the way the crowd had slowly dispersed as doubt crept in. Ahmed had left to meet with a lawyer recommended by one of the tenants, and Julia used the time to organize her thoughts. She felt like they were walking a tightrope, and any wrong step could send everything crashing down. But there was something she couldn't shake, a nagging sense that the landlord's moves weren't just about money. There was something deeper, something deliberate about how the rent hikes had targeted this specific community. Later that evening, Julia's suspicions deepened when she received an email from a source she hadn't heard from in years. It was a former colleague, someone who had worked closely with her during her early days as a journalist. The email was brief, almost cryptic, but the attachment it contained made her blood run cold. It was a series of internal documents, all linked to the landlord's company, detailing plans to redevelop the apartment complex into luxury condos. The documents revealed that the rent increases were part of a calculated effort to push out the current tenants, clearing the way for a lucrative construction project. Julia's heart pounded as she read through the files, her anger growing with every line. This wasn't just a case of greed, it was systemic exploitation, preying on vulnerable families to maximize profit. She thought about Ahmed, Rashid, Layla, and all the others who were fighting to hold on to their homes. They didn't just need help, they needed someone to expose the truth. The next morning, Julia shared the documents with Ahmed. His face darkened as he read through them, his jaw tightening with each page. "I knew it," he muttered. "I knew there was more to this." Julia hesitated before speaking. "I think we need to go public with this. These documents could change everything." Ahmed looked at her, his expression torn. "And what happens if it backfires? If the landlord finds a way to spin this against us? We've already seen how easily people dismiss our stories." Julia nodded, understanding his hesitation. She had spent enough time with this community to know the risks they faced every day, risks that went far beyond losing their homes. But she also knew that staying silent wasn't an option. "Let me write the story," she said finally. "But this time, I'll make sure it's your voices that are heard, not mine. We'll use their own words against them, and we'll make it impossible for anyone to look away." Didn't respond right away. He stared at the documents for a long moment before finally nodding. "Okay," he said quietly, "but we do this together." Over the next few days, Julia threw herself into the story. She interviewed tenants, meticulously documenting their experiences, and cross-referenced their accounts with the internal documents. She worked closely with Ahmed and Layla to ensure that every detail was accurate and that the community's perspective was front and center. The process was exhausting, but it also felt like the most important work she had ever done. But just as they were preparing to publish the article, a second twist came out of nowhere. Ahmed received a notice from the landlord's lawyer, a lawsuit claiming defamation and slander, based on Ahmed's statements at the rally. The timing was too convenient to be a coincidence. It was clear that the lawsuit was meant to intimidate Ahmed and silence the community. The news hit like a gut punch. The tenants gathered at the community center that evening, their frustration and fear spilling over. Some wanted to fight, while others worried about the legal and financial consequences. Ahmed tried to reassure them, but Julia could see the strain in his eyes. "It's a scare tactic," Layla said firmly. "They know we're close to exposing them, and they're trying to shut us down." Julia agreed, but she also knew that the lawsuit could delay everything. If they got caught up in a legal battle, it might be too late to stop the evictions. And yet, she couldn't deny the risk of moving forward. The landlord had money, power, and resources, all the things this community lacked. As the group debated their next steps, Julia's phone buzzed with a new email. It was from the same anonymous source who had sent her the documents. This time, the email contained a name, a high-ranking executive at the landlord's company who had signed off on the redevelopment plans. The message was clear. This person was the key to unraveling everything. Julia stared at the email, her mind racing. Confronting this executive could be the breakthrough they needed, but it was also a gamble. If they played their hand too soon, they might lose any leverage they had. But if they waited too long, the evictions could proceed, and the community would be scattered before the truth came to light. The stakes had never been higher, and Julia could feel the weight of every decision pressing down on her. She looked around the room, at the faces of the people who had welcomed her into their lives despite everything. They were counting on her, not just to tell their story, but to fight alongside them. "I think we have one shot at this," Julia said finally, her voice steady despite the tension in her chest. "But if we're going to do it, we need to be ready for whatever comes next." Ahmed nodded, his expression resolute. "Then let's make it count." The room fell silent, the gravity of their situation sinking in. They were on the verge of something huge, something that could either bring justice or tear everything apart. And as Julia prepared for what lay ahead, she couldn't help but wonder if she had the strength to see it through. The morning of the confrontation arrived, and the air was thick with anticipation. Julia and a small group of tenants prepared themselves for the meeting with the executive named in the email. It wasn't an official meeting, of course. There was no invitation, no agenda. They were planning to confront the executive at the landlord's corporate office, armed with their documents, testimonies, and unwavering determination. Julia's article was ready to go live, held back only by this final act. As they approached the sleek, imposing building, Julia felt her nerves tighten. She glanced at Ahmed, who looked calm on the surface but had a clenched jaw that betrayed his tension. Behind them, Layla and a few other tenants carried folders of evidence, their footsteps steady despite the gravity of the moment. They were all aware of the risks. Security might throw them out, or worse, the company might retaliate in ways they couldn't yet predict. But none of them turned back. Inside the office, the group demanded to speak with the executive. The receptionist, clearly startled by the unexpected visitors, made a call. A tense few minutes passed before they were escorted to a glass-walled conference room. The executive, a polished man in his late 50s with sharp eyes and a carefully neutral expression, entered shortly after. He introduced himself curtly and sat down, clearly sizing them up. Ahmed wasted no time. He laid out the documents, detailing the predatory rent increases, the redevelopment plans, and the targeted eviction notices. As he spoke, the executive's expression shifted from feigned indifference to thinly veiled irritation. When Ahmed finished, the room was silent for a beat before the executive leaned back in his chair and smirked. "You've done your homework," he said, his tone casual but laced with condescension. "But you're out of your depth. This is just business. People move on. It's unfortunate, but that's how the world works." Julia felt her anger flare. She leaned forward, her voice steady but firm. "This isn't just business. These are people's lives, and now the world will see exactly what kind of business you're running." The executive raised an eyebrow, clearly unshaken. "Go ahead," he said dismissively. "Write your story. But remember, defamation works both ways. You might want to think carefully before you make accusations you can't back up." It was the arrogance in his tone, the absolute confidence that he was untouchable, that pushed Julia over the edge. She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone, hitting play on the screen. The sound of the executive's voice filled the room, a recording from a private meeting sent to Julia by her anonymous source. In the recording, he was discussing the redevelopment plans in chillingly blunt terms. "They'll leave," the recording echoed. "They always do. We'll outlast them. Once they're gone, the real money starts coming in." The executive's face paled, the smirk wiped clean. For the first time, Julia saw a crack in his composure. Ahmed seized the moment, standing to address the man directly. "You're not going to intimidate us," he said. "This stops now. We have the proof, and we're not afraid to use it." The tension in the room was electric. The executive tried to regain control, muttering about legal action and confidentiality, but his threats felt hollow now. Julia could see the realization dawning on him. This wasn't just a group of tenants he could bully into submission. They had the truth on their side, and they were ready to fight for it. By the end of the day, Julia's article was live. It didn't just outline the redevelopment plans and the targeted evictions, it exposed the calculated cruelty behind them, backed by irrefutable evidence. The recording was embedded in the article, a smoking gun that left no room for doubt. The story spread quickly, picked up by larger outlets, and shared widely on social media. Public outrage followed, with protests organized outside the landlord's offices and calls for legal investigations. But just when it seemed like the tenants had won, the final twist came. Late one evening, Julia received a call from a blocked number. The voice on the other end was calm but unsettlingly familiar. It was the executive. He congratulated her on her article, but warned her that she had only uncovered the tip of the iceberg. "You think you've won," he said, "but you don't understand how deep this goes. You might have embarrassed me, but the people above me, they won't stop, and they won't play fair." The call ended abruptly, leaving Julia shaken. She shared the conversation with Almid, who looked grim but resolute. "We knew this wouldn't be the end," he said, "but we've come this far. We can't stop now." Despite the threat, the tide was turning. The lawsuit against Ahmed was quietly dropped, and the landlord's company faced mounting pressure from both the public and the authorities. For the first time in months, the tenants felt a glimmer of hope. The rent hikes were halted, and the redevelopment plans were put under review. But Julia and Ahmed knew that the fight was far from over. As the community gathered to celebrate their hard-fought victory, Julia stood in the back of the room, watching the smiles and laughter that had been so rare just weeks ago. She felt a sense of pride, but also a lingering unease. The executive's warning echoed in her mind, a reminder that the system they were up against was vast and insidious. Ahmed joined her, his expression thoughtful. "You did good, Julia," he said. "But this isn't just a story for us. It's our lives, and the fight doesn't end here." Julia nodded, her resolve strengthening. She had started this journey as an outsider, driven by guilt and curiosity. But now she was part of something bigger, a movement, a community, a fight for justice, and she wasn't going to walk away. As the evening wore on, Julia realized that the real story wasn't just about the evictions or the landlord's greed. It was about the power of resilience, the strength of a community that refused to be broken, and the courage to stand up against the odds. And though the battle wasn't over, she knew they were ready for whatever came next. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of emotions, protests, legal challenges, and media coverage. The city had been shaken awake, and the people who once felt powerless were now emboldened, rallying behind the tenants and their cause. Julia had never expected such a reaction. She had only set out to tell a story, to shed light on an injustice she'd witnessed. But as the days passed, it became clear that her article had done much more than that. It had sparked a movement. The landlord's company, once so confident in their ability to squash the resistance, found themselves on the defensive. Legal teams scrambled to respond to the mounting pressure. The public outcry was impossible to ignore. City officials, who had once turned a blind eye, were now forced to pay attention. Investigations were launched into the landlord's practices, and the redevelopment project was put on hold indefinitely. The tenants, though still cautious, began to see a glimmer of hope. For Julia, it felt like a turning point in her life. She had always been a journalist, dedicated to telling stories, but now she had become part of something bigger. She had seen firsthand how her work had impacted the lives of people she had once only observed from a distance. She wasn't just reporting the news anymore, she was helping to create it. The journey she had started with guilt and curiosity had transformed her into a passionate advocate, a voice for those who had been silenced for too long. Ahmed and the other tenants remained grounded, though. Despite the victories, there was no time for complacency. They knew the fight wasn't over. The landlord may have backed down, but there were still questions about how the city would handle the future of affordable housing. The community was stronger than ever, but they also understood that systemic change was a long and difficult road. The threat from the executive still loomed, casting a shadow of the progress they'd made. But the more Julia thought about it, the less she feared it. The executive's call had been a warning, but it had also been a sign of desperation. He could try to intimidate them, but they had something he didn't: the truth and the people's support. In the end, no amount of power or money could erase that. One evening, as the community gathered to discuss the next steps, Julia stood by the door, watching the faces of the people she had come to admire. They were a mixture of hope and caution, still uncertain about the future, but determined to keep fighting. Ahmed stood at the front, his voice calm and steady as he spoke about their next moves, how they would continue organizing, how they would ensure that the city recognized the need for affordable housing for all. When the meeting ended, Julia stayed behind. Ahmed joined her as the others filtered out. "You did something incredible," he said quietly. "But you know this isn't just my victory or Layla's or any one person's. It's all of ours." Julia smiled, but there was still a lingering heaviness in her chest. "I know, but I don't think I could have done it without you all. You're the ones who gave me the courage to write the truth." Ahmed nodded. "You gave us a voice. You don't realize how rare that is, how important it is." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the last of the tenants leave. The quiet hum of the city outside felt different now, full of possibility, even as the threat of the unknown still hung in the air. But Julia knew one thing for sure: the battle had only just begun. As the weeks turned into months, the media frenzy around the landlord's company continued. Investigations into their practices spread beyond just the city, drawing national attention. Several other tenants from other neighborhoods began reaching out, sharing similar stories. Julia knew this was a tipping point. People were no longer willing to be silent in the face of injustice. The public demand for affordable housing had never been louder, and officials were finally taking notice. In the meantime, the landlord's company, despite their best efforts to control the narrative, found themselves in damage control mode. The legal challenges they faced continued to pile up, and many of their corporate allies began to distance themselves. The executive, once so confident in his power, was now nowhere to be seen, and speculation swirled about whether he would even keep his position. Julia's investigation had done more than just uncover a series of wrongdoings. It had exposed a broken system, one that had been allowed to operate unchecked for too long. For Ahmed and the other tenants, their lives began to stabilize. The evictions were officially halted, and many families who had been threatened with displacement were able to stay in their homes, at least for now. The community center, once a place of uncertainty and fear, was now a symbol of resilience, a safe haven for those who had fought so hard to protect what they had built. One day, as Julia was walking through the neighborhood, she was approached by a woman she hadn't met before. The woman was older, with kind eyes and a quiet strength that seemed to emanate from her. "I just wanted to thank you," the woman said, "for everything you've done, for seeing us, for telling our story." Julia didn't know how to respond. She had heard the words before, but this time they hit differently. She hadn't just written a story, she had helped give people their dignity back. It wasn't just the article that mattered. It was the way it had empowered people to stand up for themselves, to speak out against the forces that had tried to keep them down. As the woman walked away, Julia realized that she had found something deeper than a story. She had found a purpose. She was no longer just a journalist. She was a part of a community, a part of something much larger than herself. And though she didn't know what the future held, she knew one thing for certain: she would keep fighting, just as they would. Together. The final twist came quietly, almost unnoticed. Months after the story had been published, as Julia prepared for another article about the ongoing fight for affordable housing, she received an anonymous tip, a piece of information about another developer, another company, planning a similar redevelopment project in another city. The cycle was far from over. But Julia was no longer afraid. She had seen the power of the people's voice, the strength of standing together, and the ability to expose the truth. And no matter how many twists and turns lay ahead, she would be ready to face them, armed with the knowledge that the fight for justice was never truly finished. It was a constant, evolving struggle, and she would continue to be its storyteller. In the end, it wasn't just about the victory. It was about the people who had fought, who had risen above their fears, and who had shown the world that they mattered. And that, Julia realized, was the real story.